So, welcome to a Global Citizen Lecture. And this time, it's an honor for me to introduce to you Peter Agre, who you all know has quite a lot to say, not only about malaria, global health, but about science in general. Peter Agre is a strong supporter of our university. I would say that he's a true ambassador of our university. He's been a collaborator since the mid-90s. He was originally taken in by global health. That was your main interest, I think. Right. And then you were carried away by basic science. Studies on red blood cells, you discovered aquaporins. You went on to receive the Nobel Prize in chemistry in 2003. And then, interestingly enough, you came back to red blood cells, to global health, to malaria. So it's a fascinating history, starting off with red blood cells, global health, and after a few years, with other interests, you are again back to your old field of knowledge and research. So it is with great anticipation, Peter, that we're looking forward to your lecture. I should also add that the institute that you're heading, you have been heading this institute since 2008, Johns Hopkins Malaria Research Institute. It's one of the leading institutes in malaria research in the world. And in fact, in 2010, I think it was, this center was named an International Center of Excellence. And there are only 10, as far as I understand, centers of excellence in the world working on malaria. So I think it's time to give the floor to you, Peter, and we're looking forward to your lecture. And if you happen to say a few words about your Norwegian genes, we won't be sad about that. Okay, please.
Thank you, Peter. Well, good afternoon. Dark, snowy. Let's talk about Africa. Peter is right. I'm part of that New World Norwegian colony in Minnesota. 5 of my great-grandparents were Norwegians. Three were from Skåne, Sweden. So I'm more Norwegian than Swedish. And I lived in a Norwegian town where it was impossible to speak about Sweden at all. So culturally, definitely feel much at home here in Norway. So I'm going to make a presentation at a sort of non-technical level. If someone is coming to hear the latest high-resolution structures of malarial proteins, I'm not prepared to talk about that today. What I'd like to do is put a human face on the malaria problem. So this will be more like a National Geographic article than a Journal of Biological Chemistry article. May I see a show of hands? Is anybody here working on malaria in the research lab? Okay. Is there anybody here who's done field work in Africa or in the malaria world? I know there are a few, okay. Anybody who's had malaria? Okay. And I didn't raise my hand. And I didn't because it shows, I was told by Nick Kristof from the New York Times, that I don't have any credibility in this field. He's had malaria and I haven't. I'd like to keep it that way. Ole Petter is right. I've had an interest in global health really from the beginning of my medical career. So just a little bit of background. Here's a photograph of one of my ancestral homes with 8 great-grandparents. Each had a different home. This is the house where my great-grandmother Ingeborg Hansdatter lived in Siljan near Skien, Norway. And the great generation of the 1880s that came to Minnesota and the Dakotas settled and farmed and had good lives, but there was a lot of emphasis on education. I think this is a real Scandinavian trait, a Norwegian trait. And my father actually was a chemistry student at the University of Minnesota, a real chemist. I consider myself a chemist wannabe. And it was really his influence about studying science that inspired my brothers and me to become medical doctors and research physicians. So this is a picture of me when I left my home in Minnesota to seek my fortune as a medical student at Johns Hopkins. I headed east to Johns Hopkins, which is an institution with a large interest in global health. That's one of the reasons I was so eager to attend there. I went east by going west, spending the better part of a year traveling through East Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, and seeing some of the areas where global health was, at least at that time, in need of some big help. It was an inspiration and an eye-opener. So I decided rather late in my career to focus on malaria. I started out as a student working on cholera, another disease of the third world, a horrific diarrheal disease. And we made some good progress on the cholera problem as a student, and it was really the lab experience as a medical student that addicted me to the basic science. So malaria. Why would we study malaria? Well, malaria is now on the decline. That's good news. There are fewer countries now that have malaria than 100 years ago. 100 years ago, there was malaria in Norway. There was an outbreak of malaria in Arkhangelsk after World War I. There was malaria up to the Great Lakes in the United States and into Ontario. Of course, the greater burden of malaria was in the south and in the tropics, but it was in fact a worldwide problem. But the fact that malaria has been controlled and eliminated from countries like Norway and Central Europe gives us real evidence that this is a 19th century disease. It's still persisting in the 21st century. Can we do something about it? So just a few statistics. There are 99 countries now. There are about 200 countries in the whole world, 99 with malaria, of which half are trying to control malaria and the other half are eliminating it. It's about 2/3 of a million, 660,000 deaths predicted by the World Health Organization. It's probably an underestimate, but that's a lot of deaths because almost all of the victims are small children, age 5 and younger. And a story which is not told often, at least has not received much press, is that the survivors oftentimes are scarred for life. Having malaria could lead to permanent lung disease, kidney injury, and brain injury. Very serious. I'll talk about that in a moment. And it's a huge prevalence, 200,000 new infections each year. The chances of getting malaria if you live in the developing country is very high. And of course, this places a second economic burden on the developing countries. They're poor because they're sick, and they're sick because they're poor. Is there something we can do in the developing world to help them break out of that? And the answer is most certainly yes. So just a little lexicon here. The terms are tossed off rather rapidly, just so you know what I mean when I use the terms. First off, the word malaria. It's an Italian word. It was believed to be due to swamp gas, malaria, bad air. And so we know that's not correct, but the name has stuck. The term control, malaria control, is a term that public health agencies use to describe a situation where most of the cases are well treated and the incidence is declining. Maybe a small percentage of the citizenry will get malaria each year, but it's largely well controlled with medicines. But it's controlled but not absent. The term eliminate means locally there's no malaria. Malaria has been eliminated from Norway, but the mosquitoes are still here. Malaria could, in theory, return. It's not likely to, but it could. The term eradicate, which received a lot of popularity, a boost when Bill and Melinda Gates 5 years ago announced that the real goal is eradication, means gone here, there, everywhere, forever. Smallpox has been eradicated. Unless there's some isolate from a laboratory that is released, it'll never affect people again. And that's, of course, our eventual goal, to eradicate malaria, but that's a very difficult task. So some of the control methods, and I'll just skip through these, you've heard about them. The long-lasting insecticide-treated bed nets. Since most mosquito biting, not all, but most mosquito biting is after dark, in many areas, if children in particular sleep beneath bed nets treated with insecticides, the mosquitoes sense a subject and they land on the surface of the net, and it's the insecticide that kills the mosquito. Pretty effective. It's had a very positive effect, as I'll show you. IRS, indoor residual spraying. This is a bit controversial, but rather than fumigating the countryside with DDT, as was done 2 generations ago, applications of tiny levels of DDT around the doorways and windowsills, so when a mosquito crawls through, it touches the insecticide. Turns out to be very effective. ACT, artemisinin and combination therapy, as the new super medicines, which I'll talk to you about, which shows great promise, but at the same time, some concerns because of drug resistance. Vaccine development, touchy subject. Do we have a vaccine? Yes. Do we have a vaccine that's worthwhile and is highly effective? No. Are we close? Well, there's a debate ongoing, but my assessment is we are not close. There's nothing out there now that I would recommend any of us take and go to the malaria belt without other protection. It may be 5 years, 10 years, it may be never. We never know, but a vaccine could be very helpful. Now, surveillance is another method that's used to identify people who are silent carriers. Children who get malaria for the first time are often severely ill, toxic, life or death, an emergency. But if they recover, they develop a little resistance, a little partial immune tolerance, so that when they get it again, they're sick, but not quite as sick. And most people in the developing world have had malaria repeatedly, and so they've developed an immune balance. They may carry the parasite at very low levels. Now, this is, of course, of no huge consequence to them, but in the tropics, when the rainy season begins, they're the place where the mosquitoes get the parasite and infect the children. So surveillance for the silent carriers is turning out to be very important. And satellite gridding of domiciles, some high-tech ability to actually localize where is everybody. Because much of the third world, in particular sub-Saharan Africa, is pretty much a network of footpaths without any road maps. To find everybody, to map the locations, we now have the technology with global surveillance. So it's not all bad. Global surveillance with satellite imaging can be very useful. Now I'm just going to skip through some of the medicines and chemicals. DDT. This is in fact a miracle substance, the most effective insecticide ever discovered. It works by activating sodium channels. But 52 years ago, Rachel Carson, who actually was a Johns Hopkins graduate, wrote the book Silent Spring, where in somewhat flamboyant fashion, the truth came out that in fact DDT, in the huge doses applied, was toxic to the environment. And so DDT, at that point, became a rogue molecule, which was abandoned with catastrophic consequences. Malaria control in, for example, Sri Lanka, which was excellent, suddenly disappeared and the malaria came back, went through the roof. So we can make a situation worse by giving up. So DDT is still used in the indoor residual spraying, but at tiny levels, which are of no consequence to the environment. Quinine, the original mainstay. It's often read that this was discovered by the Jesuit missionaries in Peru. I personally find it hard to believe that the Jesuits would discover something that the Quechua Indians didn't know about. Of course they knew about it. And it's the bark of the cinchona which actually provides quinine, which tastes great in a gin and tonic, but it's also a very effective malaria medicine, but it's pretty toxic. It's an unpleasant medicine to take, but it's the standard. Now, derivatives of quinine have been used, and maybe many of you have actually taken them. Oh, let me just mention, quinine works. Because of the lights, it probably doesn't project too well. But inside of the red cells, when they're parasitized, is a vacuole in which the parasite lives. And one of the objects the parasite must face is how to gain energy. The malaria parasite in red cells eats hemoglobin and is faced with the challenge of how to store the toxic iron-containing heme molecules. Turns out the quinine derivatives all block the storage of hemozoin so that free radical formation kills the parasite itself. So, quinine chloroquine. Chloroquine, invented actually at Johns Hopkins back in the 1930s, was for generations the most effective medicine, very cheap, fairly non-toxic. But in the 1980s, widespread resistance emerged in Southeast Asia and spread around the world. So chloroquine is still used for the treatment of vivax malaria. It's a species different from the severe falciparum, but it's not effective. And so one of the public health challenges we have is to get local governments to recognize that chloroquine is no longer useful. Mefloquine, another quinine derivative. You've perhaps read about this in the news. It's a very effective anti-malarial with rare and serious neurological consequences, neuropsychiatric problems, violent behavior. There was a recent killing in Afghanistan where it's believed the foot soldier was actually taking Lariam to prevent malaria. So this is something which is not recommended widely any longer. And artemisinin. Artemisinin, which now has changed everything, is a major reason why malaria is coming under control. Again, a folk medicine discovered in China probably 2,000 years ago to treat fevers. In South China, fevers were probably malaria. And resistance to artemisinin have now recently been identified, so we're concerned, are we back to the drawing board? So malaria prophylaxis is a major issue for people traveling to the malaria belt. And I hope, after my lecture, at least some of you will decide that visiting sub-Saharan Africa is really what you'd like to do. And if you do so, you should really protect yourself. I guess the best standard is called Malarone. It's fairly non-toxic. There are two compounds, one which is a quinine derivative, atovaquone, and another poguanol, which is a dihydrofolate reductase inhibitor. Together they work well, but the cost, about $5 a tablet. We can afford this. Our African counterparts, there's no way they can afford that. There are no effective cheap medicines for them. Now, there have been actually a series of Nobel Prizes awarded for malaria, yet it's still out there. Maybe there'll be another one. Maybe some young scientists here at the University of Oslo will really crack the code and solve this problem. The first went to this gentleman, Sir Ronald Ross, who had a great mustache. He made the intuitive leap that, in fact, malaria, studying avian malaria. Malaria are prevalent for humans, but there are species malaria for other organisms. There's a mouse malaria, similar to ours, but we can't get it. They're species specific. He studied avian malaria and was able for the first time to demonstrate that it wasn't bad air, it was an actual parasite. He won a Nobel Prize. A few years later, Alphonse Laveran, a Frenchman working in Algeria, discovered that, in fact, human malaria was also a parasite by studying the peripheral blood. Fundamental discoveries. Now, there's a third one which is a bit controversial, although there was certainly merit in the discovery. Julius Wagner-Jauregg, an Austrian, proposed that the treatment of neurosyphilis, something we don't have now because we have good medicines to treat syphilis. But before penicillin, there were no medicines. People with neurosyphilis declined and died. And by infecting people with vivax malaria, they would develop horrific fevers, and it was actually the thermal challenge which brought the neurosyphilis under control. It's sort of like fighting fire with fire. The Nobel Committee was impressed. Don't try this any longer. And the fourth was, in fact, Peter Müller, a Swiss biochemist, who didn't invent DDT, but recognized its value as an insecticide. It was a truly important discovery. Now, there's yet one other person here who I like to think of in terms of an inspiration, who won a Nobel Prize, and he won the Peace Prize. This is Albert Schweitzer, who 100 years ago, last year, founded the Lambaréné Hospital in French West Africa, Gabon. And much of the burden he took care of was, in fact, malaria. And it's really, I think, a fitting award of the Nobel Prize for the Schweitzer legacy, which I find personally inspiring, and I think many people of my generation found Albert Schweitzer really a physician, a theologian, a concert organist, the whole package, but he devoted his career to the indigent in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, you may recognize this. Yes, it's a mosquito. It's often described as the world's deadliest animal, maybe next to other humans, I guess. Mosquitoes are a nuisance. None of us like being bitten by mosquitoes. But actually, the biology of the mosquito bite is quite interesting. It's not the males that bite, it's the females. Female mosquitoes take the blood meal. The hemoglobin in the blood is the energy source for egg development. So for reproductive reasons, female mosquitoes bite and take in blood. They also have a balance problem, a fluid balance problem. Blood goes in here, fluid goes out the hind end through the Malpighian tubules. They gain so much weight from the blood meal they can't fly. It's an aquaporin problem, but I promise not to get distracted on aquaporins. So mosquitoes pass malaria, but it's a very special group of Anopheles mosquitoes. Of the 200 or so Anopheles species, about 20 will pass malaria. And we don't know why that is. Why is this small group able to do that? They don't benefit in any way from the malaria. And it's a complex life cycle, which I'll summarize briefly. A mosquito infected with malaria passes sporozoites, a special stage of the parasite from the salivary glands, and the parasite goes through 3 changes of costume, basically. The sporozoites infect, and it may be as few as 1 sporozoid gets to the liver, where in the course of about 10 days to 12 days, the liver becomes infected. And this is the reason when you take Malarone in the tropics, you have to keep taking it after you return. The myrizoites are then released from the liver where they infect red cells, and they go through an asexual cycle. They're hemizygous parasites. They infect red cells, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But a small number of them then will go through to become gametocytes, which then go back into the mosquitoes to start the cycle all over again. So it's so complicated, it sometimes amazes me that this could even be a disease. If we could intrude at any point here, we could knock it out. Yet it goes on. So the myrizoid invasion of red cells is due to a very highly specific, tight adherence of the parasite to the surface of the red cell. And this causes the well-known hemolytic anemia, which I'll describe in a little more detail in a moment. There are other issues also related to the parasite. It has a very high and very affinity and toxic relationship with the placenta. So malaria during pregnancy is a huge concern with causing stillborn infants, underweight infants, and much morbidity. And in addition, the red cells, when infected, will stick to blood endothelium, causing thrombosis. And in the brain, this is particularly severe, cerebral malaria, often fatal, and when not fatal, leading to permanent brain damage. So red cells infected with a single malaria parasite, shown here as an example. This parasite is challenged, but will grow and divide by eating the hemoglobin. In fact, a single parasite in about a couple of days will grow and divide through 5 cycles of division, leading to 32 daughter cells. Here's a schizont. 32 daughter cells, that cell breaks and releases 32 parasites. So do the numbers. 1 cycle, 32. 2 cycles, that's 32 times 32, that's 1,000. 4 cycles, that's 1,000,000. 6 cycles, that's 1,000,000,000. In a very short order, grams of malarial sludge are circulating throughout the body, causing horrific fevers and end organ damage. So it's this ramping up in the peripheral blood where the great morbidity occurs. It also causes severe problems in the brain, as I mentioned, cerebral malaria. And this is my one technical slide I'd like to share because it was performed right here at University of Oslo in the laboratory of Mahmoud Amiri Makadem in the Neuroscience Department of Anatomy, which shows the difference between a normal brain section here. So here's a blood vessel in brain, and the brain parenchyma is tightly adherent. And here's in cerebral malaria where you have swelling of the end foot. You notice it's obvious. Something is disordered. And since our brains do not have the ability to expand and contract, the skull is a fixed volume, this is part of the problem with cerebral malaria. So the high level of light makes this a little challenging, but this is to show the world malaria map. Europe doesn't appear because there's no more malaria. It's supposed to be light gray. The Western Hemisphere, there's still some persistent malaria in the Mediterranean. Here's Haiti, here's Dominican Republic. With Cuba, no malaria. The Amazon basin has a fairly heavy burden of malaria. The Pacific Islands, particularly Papua New Guinea and Indonesia, has some burden. Southeast Asia has a burden, but sub-Saharan Africa has the heaviest burden, with the exception of the Republic of South Africa and Namibia, which are pretty clean. But these are the sites of the worst burden of malaria, sub-Saharan Africa, and that's what I will focus on the rest of my talk. So we are studying currently, as part of the International Center of Excellence that Ole Petter mentioned, malaria in 3 locations. And I say we're studying it. At the same time that we're studying it, we're treating it. So some very good benefits are likely to occur. And the former colony of Rhodesia, which is now 2 different countries, Northern Rhodesia is referred to as Zambia, became independent in 1965 with a good liberal democracy led by Kenneth Kaunda. It's had fairly good infrastructure development, and there's some good signs in terms of public health. Southern Rhodesia, which is now known as Zimbabwe, a different fortune. At the time Northern Rhodesia became independent, Southern Rhodesia became independent of England, but was controlled by a white apartheid racist regime led by Ian Smith. And after a brutal civil war, control was taken by Robert Mugabe, and there's been some significant decline of this infrastructure in Zimbabwe. So these 3 locations have led to 3 different observations. I'll talk first about Macha, our location in southern Zambia, and the Zambezi River flows right through here, Victoria Falls. Good results are occurring, and this is likely to be the first place in sub-Saharan Africa with a malaria-free zone. I'll then talk a little bit about Chilengi in the north of the border of Congo, where nothing has worked. All the same tools have been employed without success. And then I'll talk at the end about Zimbabwe, where things were under good control, but they've gone the wrong direction. So any of you young people are interested in global health, want to work in malaria, there's lots to do still, trust me. So there's a fairly robust industry present in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's the coffin makers, because there's a lot of pathology. Who gets malaria? As I said, youngsters, particularly children 5 and younger. And these little boys are playing outside of our field station in southern Zambia. They're from fairly well-to-do families by sub-Saharan African standards. You notice at least some of them have sandals. They're cute, they're happy, they're fun, maybe a little naughty. This one has a slingshot. But they're vulnerable to malaria. And it's really the object of our work to prevent them from getting malaria or improve the treatments if they do. Now, this youngster was brought into the field hospital in Macha in a coma, near death, suffering from cerebral malaria, which I talked about. Usually the presentation is rapid, it's abrupt, the child falls into a coma, never to awaken. But his life was spared. And on the far right of this photograph, you'll see Philip Tuma, a Johns Hopkins pediatrician who's dedicated his entire career to working in Zambia. So he saved the youngster's life. But notice the little boy, something looks a little odd. He's gazing upward. He has a disconjugate gaze because the cerebral malaria has destroyed the visual cortex of his brain. He'll never see again. So when you think about the cost of being disabled in Norway, it's significant. To be blind or learning impaired or deaf or epileptic in sub-Saharan Africa is even more difficult. So our Malaria Research Institute, in collaboration with the Macha hospital people, have teamed up, and I'm going to tell you about some of the work, and it's been a real joy, I can assure you, to be involved in this work. So here's some of our team outside of our field station. I've mentioned Philip Tuma, the Johns Hopkins pediatrician, who's considered by Zambians as Zambian. He grew up there. His father was the mission doctor. He's actually had the life I thought I wanted to live, and so he's my hero. Also present is Sungano Marakura, shown next to me, a Zimbabwean native from a village, very modest circumstances, but an outstanding student who graduated from the University of Zimbabwe, went on to earn his PhD at Oxford University with a postdoc at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and he's our scientific director. And the others are Zambian field workers. So what does a field worker do? Well, we detect malaria in the field. We try to take care of those silent carriers so that they can't infect others. And how effective is it? This slide, which represents our 12-year experience, 13-year experience, is pretty dramatic. I'll lead you through it. So the bars represent the number of hospitalizations, the number of cases of children aged 5 and younger admitted to the Macha hospital. And what you'll see in the malaria season usually starts in November, ends in April. That's the rainy season. So in the first few years, and for decades in the past, Macha Hospital would have somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 cases with between 30 and 100 fatalities. And this is for a catchment area of about 100,000. Now, the introduction of artemisinin and combination therapy in the year 2003 had a dramatic downshift in the prevalence. The cases were followed up, as you'll see in the pictures to follow, with surveillance of the locales. So a child is admitted with malaria, she's treated, returned to the village where everybody is screened and those carriers are all treated. So after 2 years, suddenly we've dropped from 1,000 cases down to about 100, from 100 deaths down to 6, and then the next year, due to planning problems in Lusaka, the medicine was unavailable, a stock outage. Immediate return, and this is the problem with malaria. Once you stop, it comes right back. So in 2006, a big spike in the prevalence, but then the medicines were returned in 2007. And then the insecticide-treated bed nets were made available. And these are very effective when given in combination with active surveillance and aggressive diagnosis and treatment. So we're now out in this limb. It's under what we would call control. It's not gone altogether. Macha Hospital still has 50 or so cases a year, although so far, it's the middle of January, so far not one case this year, this malaria season. And the deaths are now between 1 and 5. So much better, about a 97% decline in the prevalence of malaria, just because of the simple work done by field stations with a modest amount of support from the West. So I talked about the satellite gridding. You can see probably a lot of dots and some lines. Basically, what it is this is where all the colored dots represent where cases of malaria have been identified, either through the clinics, regional clinics, or at the hospital, followed up by surveillance. And it turns out most commonly the villages that were affected were along the class 3 waterways, small streams that were never dry in the dry season, but are not big rushing rivers. This is where mosquitoes love to breed. So getting back here to the villages is not altogether trivial. First off, the main roads themselves are often blocked in the rainy season. Flash floods occur all of the time, which makes it a challenge to get around. And the villages themselves, I don't know if you can see that, But here's the pathway leading to one village we visited. We were driving the Land Cruiser. This is at the beginning of the rainy season, probably in January, where the grass is just 20 centimeters tall. By the end of the rainy season, of course, the grass is 2 meters tall. Really difficult to get. And what's on the other end of the path? These lovely little domiciles, little farms, where the world's poorest agricultural workers toil to survive and take care of their families. And they're really a wonderful group of people. And they use very modest methods. Here's the chicken coop. You see these little branch spliced layers for the guinea fowl. And here's one of our workers. This is Harry Hamapu doing field surveillance. Those of you close enough can see he's got his Johns Hopkins Malaria Research Institute cap on and clean gloves, a workstation right there in the domicile, testing the peripheral blood to identify carriers. And the response is very positive. Now these, again, are the poorest of the poor. These are the individuals working for $1 to $2 a day, getting by. But then one of the children gets malaria, the whole system comes to a halt. So it's a devastating problem, and it's not the only problem, but it's the one we're working on. Now my job, I kind of stand around with my hands in my pocket. I know this looks like kind of a useless activity. The African workers are really capable. I guess I see my job more as fundraising and cheerleading, but it's really joyful to be part of the team. And here's one of the families. They're very religious usually. Not a lot of smiles. That's not a rural African characteristic. Not a lot of glee is expressed. It's a serious issue. But trust me, they're very grateful. And they have really religious names. It's interesting. I think this gentleman's name is Isaac. Remember one morning we met Benjamin, we met Lazarus, we met Rachel, Miriam, Shadrach, Meshach. We never met Abednego. He's out there somewhere. These Old Testament names. And the children, it's hard not to have a warm place in your heart when you see them. Here's one of the farmers. And the farm implements, well, they're using technology that disappeared in the West 150 years ago because that's what's available to them. So to say they labor to grow their crops is not an exaggeration. They labor intensely, and everybody's working. Even the industrial firms will use hand labor. These slashers are actually sliced from 50-gallon barrels and sharpened. Imagine mowing down a multi-hectare site by hand. It doesn't seem efficient, but that's what they have. And I say everybody's working, including the children. The older kids take care of the younger kids. They carry the maize by hand to the village to be milled. It's really a difficult life, but you can see smiles at least on one of the faces here. They're not unhappy people when they have their health. And even the pregnant women coming to the hospital to give birth will walk carrying their goods. Now there's a myth that's sometimes perpetrated by cynical individuals, particularly some of our less admirable politicians, about the third world being an ungrateful population and not revering the quality of life. You've heard this probably. Sharing from our experience, this is anything but the truth. In sub-Saharan Africa, they revere children. They adore their children. And the investment in the children's well-being is their first priority. And they're cute little kids. There's several pictures. I love to take their pictures just because they're so adorable. Learning to walk. Multi-generational. Here's a grandfather or a great-grandfather with the little boy. And school is a big issue. They try really hard to use the resources. You can't see it, but this adorable little girl has her school book upside down. It says, "School is cool." Pretty good attitude. And of course, the workstation provides jobs for the local Zambians who otherwise would be doing fairly insubstantial activities. Mr. Demby, entrepreneur. This man is a construction leader. He started a company, and all of our buildings at the field station and the hospital are manufactured from local products, local bricks. Here's the crew making a series of apartments for our health workers. So the market isn't like the market you would see in the West. They're open air. A lot of recycled goods, as you'll see in a moment, and cheaply manufactured goods from East Asia. But you'll see things in the heart of sub-Saharan Africa, like this Minnesota Vikings football warm-up jacket. I don't think this individual had a clue who the Minnesota Vikings football team might be. And they're not a particularly good team lately. This is a popular one, particularly little boys, Barack Obama t-shirts. There's great respect for our president in sub-Saharan Africa. I dare say we could have more in the United States. I remember jogging in the countryside one morning, and a group of little boys going to school stopped me. He said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm just jogging." Then, of course, they asked, "Where are you from?" I said, "I'm from the United States. Barack Obama is my president." And they immediately replied, "Yes, he is our hero." So I'll talk a little bit about their work in Chilenge. It's actually just more recently started. Chilenge is the site up in the border of Congo. This is an extension of the Congo, the Katanga region of Congo. This is the area of great conflict because there's actually considerable mineral wealth there. But it's an area of great poverty and huge malaria burden. And I guess you can't see this too well, but it's a really swampy area of northern Zambia. It's hard to get there. This is my wake-up call, so I don't talk forever. Below there's a lot of slash-and-burn agriculture. They cut down the forest, they burn the forest, and they grow what they can. And we were flying the first time to Chilenge. We had to bivouac around a thunderhead. And there in the river, I couldn't get a photograph. We went by so fast. It was a huge cabin cruiser, a yacht with a palace on the side. This was the summer palace of the governor of Katanga province, Congo. So there's a real problem with the redistribution of wealth in that part of the world. So here we flew in and put down over the village of Chilenge, which is a seasonal malaria area with very, very heavy endemic malaria. It's there all year, and the deployments have not been successful. So our plane put down, and we were immediately met by the local welcoming committee, basically 100 fairly poorly behaved little boys who thought this was extraordinary to see an airplane in their village. But they were really a lot of fun. Here they are celebrating our arrival. So there is, in fact, a partner institution in Chilenge and in our other sites with African organizations, non-governmental organizations. In this case, the Tropical Diseases Research Center is a Government of Zambia program where we're working in partnership. Now I'm going to close by talking about our work in Zimbabwe, which is just south of Zambia. So it's amazing that geopolitical considerations are so important in terms of malaria. This is the Colonial Bridge at Victoria Falls, where Zambia on the left is connected to Zimbabwe on the right. Very beautiful country. Now Zimbabwe is ruled by Robert Mugabe and his regime. And I was asked to be frankly political. Olapeta, you'll protect me, I hope. In fact, Mugabe was the liberator of Zimbabwe. We have to give him credit. It was a horrific apartheid regime. But after a brutal civil war, he took control, but has maintained control with the erosion of the infrastructure. He was just re-elected president last year at the age of 89. It's not a good organization. And of course, the public health infrastructure is eroded, and guess what? Malaria is back. Now, how do you do work in a place like Zimbabwe with a cruel regime? Well, there's a wonderful book that I read as a student, The Prince by Machiavelli. Sometimes you have to swallow your pride and work with your adversary to achieve a common goal. So in fact, there are members of the Mugabe regime who've been hired to work with us, and this Shungu Munadi is one member of the Mugabe family. She's a very wonderful person. We don't talk about politics, trust me, but gives us access to do our work. And has anybody here been to Zim? Okay, a couple hands. Am I exaggerating? This is perhaps almost as beautiful as Norway. I mean, it's an extraordinarily lovely country, and we're working in the Handi Valley, right on the border with Mozambique, another country with some challenges. And they have hospitals. This is the Hauna Hospital. The actual structure itself is pretty reasonable. It needs some fixing up, but it's not like we have to start all over. So I showed before the wonderful outcomes in southern Zambia with a great decline in the prevalence of malaria. What you'll see from this bar graph, this was just published, is that it has not declined very much in Zim, and in fact, it was getting quite much more severely a problem. In 2008, which was the year from hell, when the last election held with all kinds of insurrection, malaria declined. In spite of the activities shown here, the diagnostics, the artemisinin, the indoor residual spraying, it's not declined very much. And these are thousands of deaths. So the population of the Handi Valley is 100,000. If they have records at 50,000 cases of malaria, it means it's pretty prevalent. Almost everybody gets it. Yet they have competent people, non-political. This is Dr. Msembo, who's the regional health director for Mutasa district. We're working with him. He's a University of Sheffield graduate. He's smart, he's committed, and he's really a good leader. And they have these wonderful nursing staff, Simon and his colleagues, in tiny little village clinics. These young men work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Tireless, dedicated, and they're effective when they can get the medicines. It's the infrastructure, the organization of the provision of medicines that's the problem. And here's Simon with his team at the St. Peter's Clinic. But every morning, same thing, a huge wave of women bringing their children in, sick with a variety of illnesses, but malaria more than any other. This is a village health worker, a nurse. They're basically like nurse practitioners. And she's not moaning, she's actually crying with joy when we told her we would like to help support their efforts. And here are some of her research team, or an HIV research team that was working there. So photographing these children is sometimes a bit of a challenge. Here I am with a group of Zimbabwean school children. And what I noticed is that if I try to photograph the little boys, they want to show what athletic prowesses and dangerous characters they are. When I photograph the little girls, they're so well behaved. It reminds me of my own children. I mean, these African kids have the same qualities I think that all of our kids have. And it is truly an extraordinarily beautiful area. The northern part of the Handi Valley is a tea growing area. It should be quite wealthy, and there is some prosperity. There's a little boy driving the factory tractor. But the malaria is a real issue. These people all are vulnerable and probably have had malaria. And the locals are very ambitious, selling fruit, doing what they can. Now, this gentleman had such a wonderful outfit, I had to photograph him. In Zimbabwe, they have many people with religious names and also their own very interesting group of names. We met one of our team members, his name is Love More. His brother's name is Give More, Pray More, Learn More. I met an old fellow in Eastern Zim, his name was Never. I said, Never can't be a name. He says, well, it's short for Nevermore. So there must be a story. Said, yes, in fact, he was the youngest of 9 children. When he was born, his mother said, you're nevermore. And as I said, they're very religious here. They are baptizing the youngsters in the river. And they really have a joyful existence. if we could help them with their health efforts. And so here's Sungano, our scientific director. His dream is to return to Zim. We have, I think probably in the United States, as in Norway, a group of third world people who come for study, and why would they go back? There's no opportunity. But in fact, in his case, it is his dream, and it's just this month now he's taken a position back in Zimbabwe where we'll expand our efforts even more effectively. In Uganda, where they have, of course, terrific problems with malaria, HIV, TB, and Ebola. And it's the same plan. We have health workers working nonstop, but every day, this is a group of HIV orphans and mothers bringing in their children for treatment. So a lot of the third world is better than it was, but it's still a challenge. So with that, I guess I'd just like to end by challenging us. Anybody speak Mandarin? The word for crisis. Two characters. Wei, a time of danger, and Ji, a time of opportunity. And I think the dangers that they have in Africa, of course, are many of them amenable to Western medicine, the kind of aid that's been provided, Norway being a leader, and the kinds of work that we can all do there. And so I see this as really the best job I've ever had, having a great time. That's my presentation. Thank you so much for attending.
So I think it would be highly appropriate that you would be here to respond to some questions from the audience. And I would just, if you allow me, to come up with one comment. I think that one of the strongest messages that you send to the audience and to the world at large is that when it comes to a disease like malaria, it's not sufficient to just consider the biomedical aspects. You have to look into the political aspects. Yes. Because it seems to me that when you are contrasting these three different sides in Africa, what really counts is the political state of the community. And I think this is exactly what we are so interested in at the University of Oslo now, to try to identify the political determinants of health, which are certainly extremely important. So with this, Peter, I would like to open for questions from the audience. So please, if there should be any question, we would really pass them on to Peter.
In the back, please. Could you stand up so everybody, thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Rolando. I'm from the Philippines, and I'm under the Erasmus Mundus program in Special Inclusive Education. I come here to know about malaria, since Philippines is also a dengue vulnerable country, and this topic really interests me. You mentioned a while ago that the most affected sectors of malaria are children and mothers. And I'm practically interested, how should we mobilize children and parents themselves to push for the eradication of malaria in certain communities? And second question is, have there been efforts to integrate the concept of malaria in health education in education systems? Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. So, how to educate children? Well, we're talking about children who are between 6 months and 5 years of age, so we have to be cautious and not overly optimistic. But I think school children can be educated to at least recognize that being sick, this in the malaria belt, is a distinct possibility. It's not 100% clear that a child with a fever has malaria, so rapid diagnostic testing must be done. So basically the awareness is a big issue. And I think this has been pretty well recognized even in Europe, where malaria was endemic until end of World War II. Now, Mussolini is nobody's hero, but he did lead to the control of malaria in Italy, one by draining the Pontine swamps, which was an environmental challenge, but by increasing the educational level so people understood that it was likely to be malaria if children were febrile. And the treatment of pregnancy with prophylactic Fansidar every couple of months has been effective in keeping that problem well under control. Okay, is there another question? Yes, please.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm from the School of Pharmacy, and I was wondering, do you sometimes collaborate with the traditional practitioners, medicine men, and have you looked into the use of traditional herbs against malaria?
Sure, this is a very good point. You have worked in the third world, I believe. So the traditional healers are present throughout a lot of sub-Saharan Africa. And Dr. Tuma, whose photograph I showed you, the Johns Hopkins pediatrician, is very sensible. He basically makes pacts with friendships with the traditional healers so they understand what each can do. And the traditional healers realize what they can do and what they can't do. And what they cannot do is treat malaria with folk medicine. Casting spells and things like that don't work on malaria. And almost universally, he's had a positive response so that the local healers are treated with respect and dignity. The indignity oftentimes makes a problem confrontational and becomes adversarial. So they have their realm and he has his realm. But where it's a clear infectious disease where the treatment with antibiotics are needed, the local traditional healers actually help refer the patients to the hospital. Now, the screening of folk remedies and herbs and the like is a major industry by pharmaceutical companies. And I'm fully aware that at universities in particular, pharmaceutical companies don't have a universally good reputation. They're viewed as profiteering. But in terms of malaria, it's a little different now. Certainly GlaxoSmithKline makes a big profit selling Malarone. But they also have a program, Diseases of the Developing World, where all profits are put in a pool, and the challenge is to develop new medicines rapidly, efficiently, and the charges be minimized. And other big pharmas are doing the same. And I think screening for natural products is a huge issue worldwide, but it's always a long shot. But we can thank the locals for the discovery of quinine and artemisinin, so there may be other compounds out there. And artemisinin has been only widely used for the last 20-some years. So there may be other medicines out there. Thank you.
This is Girma. I'm also from School of Pharmacy. Thank you for the very fine presentation. I have a question on these drugs, medicines used in Africa. Now we are on the last resort as far as malaria is concerned, AZTs. Because every medicine that we had already, starting from quinine, we have literally lost everything. Monotherapy is not an option, and we are on the final bullet. So with the kind of use of medicine that we have in Africa, how far or how likely are we going to use AZTs to treat malaria in that part of the world where you're researching?
Sure.
Thank you.
May I ask, what country are you from originally?
I am from Ethiopia.
Ethiopia.
Yeah, and
Sure. Beautiful country with some big problems.
Thank you.
You're
And
aware.
in Ethiopia also, AZT was introduced in 2004.
Right,
There are many problems that we cannot talk here,
sure.
but we are using them effectively.
Sure,
Thank
so
you.
let me just reiterate. The gentleman is speaking about ACT, artemisinin combination therapy, not azidothymidine, AZT, which is an HIV medicine. In the last 5 years, evidence of resistance has appeared first in Southeast Asia, and it's not an absolute resistance, but usually treatment with artemisinin combination therapy, within 24 hours, parasites are gone from the peripheral blood. But we're finding that in a small population, some parasites persist for 36, 48 hours. This is the first sign of drug resistance. And paper was published in Nature magazine just 2 weeks ago describing some genetic loci which may explain this. So the issue of drug resistance is very frightening, because if the artemisinin is no longer effective, we have no first-line drugs. And one of the concepts which actually emerged here in Norway, Gro Harlem Brundtland, is sustainability. Not just doing everything and then leaving, but how to sustain the activities. And so I think the development of new drugs, and there are several people here from the pharmacy school, this is an important issue which we can't give up. But personally, I think even with the resistance, better deployment of medicines, more efficient distributions, and very strict policies, policing for counterfeit medicines. I didn't get into it, but one of the huge problems in the developing world is that the medicines are sold at the local shop. So there's a profit to be made, and there are counterfeiters who are extremely efficient. They make counterfeit medicines that look so authentic, I can't tell. We always call the pharmaceutical companies to confirm lot numbers. So there's some big challenges there, and thank you for raising those.
My name is Kirsten Borsa Haraldsen from Science Library. Thank you for your presentation. You were saying that it's about 20 mosquito species that is
Yes.
giving the malaria, and this is nothing the health politician, is more biology question. If the host or the vector that was going further north, like to Italy
Yes.
and Europe, how many species would that be of the malaria mosquitoes that might happen coming again with
Sure.
climate
Well,
warming and
in sub-Saharan Africa, they're all from the genus Anopheles. Anopheles gambiae is a very prevalent malaria-carrying mosquito. Anopheles arabiensis, Anopheles funestis. I can't tell them apart, but in Asia they have other species, Anopheles stevensii, and in Europe other Anopheles. So there are Anopheles mosquitoes in Europe, and probably even Norway, which could in fact become infected if the parasite is brought here and nothing is done about it. So everyone remains vulnerable.
yeah.
Now you have more.
And that's my other question. Is I guess we know that, but I don't remember. Is malaria a problem for other mammal species and primates? And if so, do we do some research in primates
Yes.
in the United States?
Sure.
where you
So,
actually can-
so there are, in fact, species of malaria that will infect rodents, mouse malaria, Plasmodium berghii. We can study it in the lab knowing that we will not be ourselves infected, because it's only will infect rodents, mice. The human malarias will not infect mice, so they're very selective, and we don't understand the specificity. Now, you asked about primates. Where did malaria come from? Presumably it came from primates in Central Africa somewhere. But they have their own malaria in chimpanzees, which is very similar to Plasmodium falciparum, the major killer, the malignant malaria of humans, called Plasmodium reichenauii. Yet reichenauii will infect chimps and gorillas, but not us. There's some differences that we don't know. Now, we're very careful because there are great limitations in the studies of primates now. So not much can be done about that, but it is a provocative observation and probably shows the power of evolution. So the hemolytic anemias such as sickle cell anemia, glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase, the hemoglobinopathies are very common in the malaria world because it provides some partial resistance to malaria. So there's a lot of genetic variation which malaria has driven.
Okay, I think it's time to say that, okay, this discussion is over. And it's my pleasure to once again extend our gratitude to you, Peter, for coming here to give malaria, as you said, a human face. And I dare say that for the students who are present here today, you will immediately recognize that this is an issue, a challenge that there is worthwhile considering going into. Because what the university is supposed to do is to educate the leaders for tomorrow, and the leaders for tomorrow, they have to grapple with the global challenges, including those that we have been discussing today. So thank you very much, and this is a token of our gratitude, Peter. So thank you for coming, and thank you for giving us this.
Thank you.